My brother scoffed. Family should always share. After expecting me to hand over my home so he and his new wife could move in, I smiled and said, "It's time you accepted that my front door doesn't come with your name on it." The whole thing started with a phone call on a Wednesday night in late September. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a sink full of dishes, when my mom said my brother and his new wife were in a bind. At first, I thought she meant something small and temporary, like a broken car or a medical bill. That is how these conversations usually started in my family. Something bad would happen to my brother, and somehow I would end up being expected to smooth it over. I had gotten used to that pattern years ago, even if I never fully liked it. My mom said their apartment lease was ending earlier than they expected. She said the landlord had decided to sell the building. She said they needed somewhere to stay for a few months while they figured things out. I remember leaning against the counter and feeling that old familiar warning in my stomach. I asked where they were planning to go. She said they were hoping I would let them stay at my house. I did not answer right away because I honestly thought I had misheard her. My house was a small 3-bedroom ranch on the north side of Dayton. I bought it after 7 years of saving, working overtime, and saying no to a lot of things other people seem to get casually. It was not huge. It was not fancy, but it was mine. I had spent nearly every weekend for 2 years fixing it up. I pulled old carpet out myself. I replaced light fixtures. I painted the entire place one room at a time. I learned more about plumbing than I ever wanted to know. That house was the first thing in my life that ever felt fully stable. My mom said my brother and his wife would only need the spare rooms for a little while. She said family helped family. She said I had space. She said I was being dramatic when I went quiet. I told her I was not giving away my house. I told her they were not moving in. She got offended so fast it was almost impressive. She said I was acting like I owned a luxury condo instead of a normal family home. She said my brother was newly married and trying to build something. She said I should be proud to help. That was the first time I realized this was not a request. This was a script she had already decided I would follow. I said no again. She sighed like I was being cruel on purpose. Then she told me I was making my brother panic. I hung up before I said something I could not take back. I stood in my kitchen for a while after that, just listening to the fridge hum. I was irritated, but I was not yet worried. That part came later. My brother Eric has always been the kind of person who can turn pressure into sympathy. He is funny in a loud, effortless way. He talks fast. He remembers just enough details to sound thoughtful. He was the one my mom always called the easy one. I was the responsible one. That was the family language for boring. Eric got forgiven for things. I got thanked for not causing problems. When we were kids, I was the one who put the dishes away and took out the trash without being asked. Eric was the one who convinced people to laugh when he got caught skipping something. By the time we were adults, the pattern had hardened. If Eric made a mess, everyone pitched in. If I made a choice, everyone treated it like a policy decision. I used to think that was normal. It took me a long time to understand that being the stable son in a family like mine often meant being treated like public property. Eric married a woman named Kelly in early August. They had only been together a little over a year, but they acted like they were already a finished product. She seemed polite enough to me at first. She always smiled too hard around my mom. She always asked leading questions about money. She always had some reason to mention how expensive everything was. I did not dislike her. I just never forgot that she and Eric were a team. The part that bothered me was that they always seemed to be shopping for a way out of their own problems. The first time I heard they were struggling financially, I was not surprised. They had bought furniture on credit. They had gone on a honeymoon they probably should not have taken. They both liked the idea of looking settled before they actually were. That is their business. It only became mine when they decided my house could be the bridge between their fantasy and reality. A few days after my mom's call, Eric texted me asking if we could talk. He said it was important and that he wanted to handle it like adults. That wording should have warned me. Whenever Eric said he wanted to handle something like adults, it usually meant he had already told someone a version of the story that left out the parts that mattered. I told him we could talk on the phone. He ignored that and showed up at my place after work. He did not ask if it was a good time. He just knocked, walked in when I opened the door, and immediately started talking about the lease situation. He said Kelly had just started a new job. He said moving now would be a disaster. He said the house was practically perfect for them. He said they would even keep to themselves. I told him the house was not an option. He laughed in that fake way people do when they think your boundary is a joke. He said I was not using all the space anyway. He said the guest room was empty. He said the basement was unfinished but usable. He said I was being stubborn for no reason. I told him I was not discussing it. That annoyed him immediately. He started pacing through my living room like he already lived there. He pointed out things in my house as though he were appraising property he intended to inherit. He said it would be temporary. He said it would give them time to save for a deposit. He said I would barely notice them. I told him again that the answer was no. He said Mom thought I would be more generous. That was the first moment my patience thinned. I told him it was interesting that he came to me with his own housing crisis and somehow still found time to recruit my mother. He looked offended, which is always his first defense. He said family should always share. He said I was acting selfish. He said one day I would need help too. I told him I already had help when I needed it, and it came in the form of a mortgage I paid on time every month. That shut him up for maybe 10 seconds. Then he told me I was acting like a landlord instead of a brother. That line bothered me because it was almost clever, and I hate when manipulative people manage to sound clever. I told him the reason I sounded like a landlord was because I had done all the work of one. I had signed the papers. I had made the payments. I had fixed the roof leak. I had paid the property taxes. I had called the utility companies. I had spent 3 weekends replacing the sewer line cap in the yard because the previous owner had ignored it for years. No part of that had involved Eric. He left angry. The next morning, my mom called again. This time she said I had hurt Eric's feelings. She said Kelly was stressed. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing. I asked her whether she had offered her own house. She said that was different because she and my dad had a mortgage and a smaller place. I told her that sounded exactly like why they should keep their problem in their own lane. She said I was talking like a stranger. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Because the truth was, I had spent most of my adult life trying not to sound like a stranger in my own family. I had paid for my own college. I had worked through layoffs. I had driven 6 hours at a time to help my parents when my dad had back surgery. I had loaned Eric money once when his truck transmission died, and he still managed to tell people later that I had been understanding because I had more money. The loan got repaid eventually, but even that became family mythology. Nothing I did stayed simple. Everything I gave turned into a story about how I was supposed to give more. I ignored the calls for 2 days after that. On Friday, Eric sent a group text with our mom and dad included. He said he and Kelly were under serious pressure. He said they only needed a place for 3 to 6 months. He said he knew I had room. He said family ought to work together. He said he did not understand why I would leave them scrambling when I had an entire home sitting there. My dad never says much in situations like this. He is a soft-spoken man and usually tries to keep the peace by saying almost nothing. But even he sent a message saying we should all try to help one another. That annoyed me more than Eric's message did. It felt like a committee had formed around my house without asking me to attend. I did not argue in the group chat. I said the house was not available. I said that was final. Then I muted the thread. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it got worse. Eric started calling relatives. I found that out because my Aunt Linda texted me asking whether I was really refusing to let my brother stay with me. I asked where she had heard that. She said my mom said I had plenty of room and was being difficult. I told Aunt Linda the truth. I told her I had been asked to hand over my house. She sent back a line of ellipses that somehow managed to feel judgmental and supportive at the same time. Then she told me she would stay out of it. She did not stay out of it for long. By the following Sunday, my cousin Ben called and said Eric had mentioned I was acting like I was too good for the family house situation. That was not even a real phrase. It was just Eric taking the facts and stretching them until they sounded moral. I started getting calls from people I had not heard from in months. Nobody was directly rude, but the pressure was obvious. Everyone had a tone like they expected me to realize I was being difficult once enough people pointed it out. That made me angrier than the original ask. Because now it was no longer just Eric trying to use me. Now the whole family was trying to convert my boundary into a character flaw. The thing that finally got me to dig in seriously was not one dramatic event. It was a weird little mismatch in one of Eric's stories. He told my mom I had once said they could stay with me if they ever needed to. My mom repeated that to me like she believed it. I knew I had not said that. I would remember saying that. But the fact that Eric was willing to invent a prior agreement told me he was not just hopeful. He was building a case. So I went through my texts. I know that sounds paranoid, but I have learned that people who are used to getting their way often stop arguing facts and start arguing memory. They rely on confusion. They rely on you being too embarrassed to produce receipts. I found the first text from Eric asking if Kelly and he could crash at my place for a few months. I found my reply saying no, because I value the peace in my house and was not set up for house guests. I found the follow-up where he asked again and suggested he could pay me something. I found my reply saying that was not the issue and I was not interested. I found my mom texting me a heart emoji after Eric's lease story, which was somehow more irritating than a full speech. I found nothing, absolutely nothing, that could be twisted into a promise. That should have been enough to make me feel better. Instead, it made me realize how intentionally he had been pushing. I started wondering what else he had told people. A week later, I got a call from a friend of my dad's who works in insurance. He asked me carefully whether I was really adding my brother to my homeowner policy. I said I absolutely was not. He went quiet for a moment and then told me Eric had mentioned he would be living with me and wanted to know about coverage for the house. That was the first time I felt something colder than anger. It was disbelief, because now Eric was not just trying to guilt me. He was telling people a housing arrangement was already in place. He was speaking as if my house were a pending group project. I called Eric immediately. He did not answer. I left a voicemail telling him to stop using my address for any conversation about housing and that he was not moving in. That night he texted me asking why I was being hostile. I did not respond. Instead, I pulled the county property record. The deed was in my name alone. The mortgage was in my name alone. The homeowner's insurance was in my name alone. The utility accounts were in my name alone. There was nothing to dispute. Still, I wanted hard copies of everything. I printed the deed. I printed the mortgage statement. I printed the closing documents from when I bought the house 4 years earlier. I put them in a folder because I had a bad feeling I would need them. At the time, I thought I was just being cautious. I did not know yet how useful that folder would become. 2 days later, Eric and Kelly showed up at my house with 2 plastic storage bins and a mattress bag. I was in the front yard trimming the azaleas because I had the kind of life where I now cared about shrubs. Eric stepped out of his truck looking annoyed that I was outside. Kelly had her arms crossed and a tight expression that told me she had already decided I was the obstacle in the story. Eric asked where they should put their things. I stood there with the hedge trimmers still in my hand and asked why they had brought anything. He said they were moving in. I remember staring at him for a second because I honestly thought he might be joking. He was not. He said my mom told him I had calmed down. He said he figured I would come around. He said he did not want to make this harder than it had to be. I looked at Kelly, who was clearly trying not to look nervous. Then I told them they could not move in. Eric's face changed immediately. He went from annoyed to offended to openly angry in about 3 seconds. He said he already arranged for movers that weekend. He said I was humiliating him. He said Kelly had told people they were relocating. He said he had already given notice where they were. That was the moment I realized how far he had taken this. He had not just asked people to believe in a possibility. He had made actual plans based on my house being available. That was not my mistake. That was his. I told him to take the bins back to the truck. He started in again about family. He said I was being heartless. He said the house had 2 spare rooms and one of them could be his office. He said I was making this personal. I told him it was personal because he had decided my home was his backup plan. Kelly finally spoke up and said they were desperate. She said they had sold some furniture already because they thought they were moving. That was the first time I felt a tiny flash of guilt because I could tell she really did believe this was about to work. But guilt and obligation are not the same thing. I told them they needed to figure out another option. Eric said that another option was impossible. Because of the timing, I asked whether he had signed a new lease before checking with me. He refused to answer. That told me enough. He had been gambling on pressure. My refusal had probably never been part of his plan. He thought I would fold once he showed up in person. He was wrong. He left that day without unloading the boxes, but not before saying I was going to regret making things so ugly. I should have let that roll off me. Instead, I went inside and checked all my locks. I was annoyed enough to do it even though I had no reason to think he would come back. Then I sat at my desk and wrote out a timeline of every text, call, and visit. I do that when I am trying to separate emotion from facts. It helps me stay calm. I have learned that the moment someone starts rewriting reality, the best thing you can have is a clean timeline. It sounds dramatic now. At the time, it just felt practical. I wrote down the date he first asked. I wrote down the date I said no. I wrote down the date my mom repeated his request. I wrote down the insurance question. I wrote down the storage bins. I wrote down everything because I had already started to suspect this was going to turn into a family-wide mess. The next family dinner confirmed it. My parents asked me over on a Sunday and I almost declined. But I figured avoiding it would only let Eric keep controlling the story. So I went. My mom had made pot roast and mashed potatoes, which would have been comforting in any other context. Eric and Kelly were already there when I arrived. My dad looked tired. My mom looked determined in that way she gets when she thinks she is managing people for their own good. The whole table had that strange energy you only get when everybody is pretending the main issue is not sitting right there. We made it through about 15 minutes of small talk before my mom brought up the housing problem again. She said Eric and Kelly were still stuck. She said they had already begun packing. She said she could not believe I would let this become a fight. I asked her when it became my responsibility. She said that was exactly the wrong attitude. Eric jumped in fast. He said he had assumed I would help because that is what brothers do. I asked him whether brothers also show up unannounced with a mattress bag after being told no repeatedly. He told me I was being cold. I asked him whether he told the family I had agreed. He looked at my mom instead of me. That was all I needed. I told them I had never agreed to anything. I told them I had text records. I told them I had printed the conversations. Eric laughed at that in a way that was meant to sound dismissive. He said I was acting like this was a legal case. I told him if he kept pushing, that was exactly what it would become. That got the table quiet. My dad stopped chewing. Kelly looked down at her plate. My mom said I was threatening my own family over a roof. I told her I was protecting my property from being claimed by people who had not asked properly and were now trying to rewrite the facts. Eric finally said the sentence that changed the tone of the entire room. He said family should always share. He said it loud enough that my dad set his fork down. He said it like he expected the words themselves to end the argument. I remember looking at him and feeling something settle in me. I was tired of the whole performance. I was tired of being made to sound unreasonable for saying no to a grown man who had already made a mess of his own plans. So I smiled, not because I was amused, because I had already decided I was done trying to persuade him emotionally. I told him it was time he accepted that my front door did not come with his name on it. Nobody spoke for a second after that. My mom looked shocked in a way that suggested she had expected me to cave much earlier. Eric's face flushed red almost immediately. Kelly looked embarrassed, but also relieved, which I thought was interesting. My dad looked like he wished he had quietly gone to bed after dinner instead of getting trapped in a showdown. Eric started talking over me, saying I was disrespectful. I told him I was being clear. He said I was humiliating him in front of his wife. I told him he did that all on his own when he assumed my house was available without asking me once, and accepting no for an answer. My mom said I was being cruel. I told her I was being accurate. That was when Eric made the biggest mistake. He said he had already told people he was moving in because he had been helping me with the house. He said he had put money into repairs over the years. He said that counted for something. I almost laughed because I knew exactly where this was going. Eric had done 2 things around my house in 4 years. He had helped me carry a couch up the driveway, and he had paid me back for a pizza order once when his card failed. That was it. But he said it in the kind of way that sounds confident if nobody has the paperwork. So I went home after dinner, pulled the folder I had prepared, and started checking every receipt I had kept from home repairs and renovations. I keep records because I am annoying like that. I save receipts from the hardware store. I save emails from contractors. I save everything connected to the house because it is expensive and because the previous owner had been a disaster. By Monday afternoon, I had a stack of documents on my dining room table. I had the closing statement. I had the deed. I had the mortgage records. I had proof of every payment I had made. I had receipts for all the materials I had bought. I had screenshots of every text where Eric asked, implied, or demanded. I had one text from him where he admitted they had sold some furniture based on their assumption that they were moving in. That was the text that made me stop feeling guilty, because up until then I had still been worried about whether I was being too rigid. Then I saw the message and realized he had already started spending money on a house that was not his. That was not me failing him. That was him overcommitting on a lie. My first instinct was to call my mom and try to calm things down. I did call her. It did not go well. She told me I was focusing on technicalities instead of family needs. She said Eric was in a bad place. She said Kelly's parents lived out of state. She said a few months in my house would stabilize everything. I asked her whether she had ever once considered asking me how I felt about any of this before telling other people I would do it. She said I always made things harder than they had to be. That was the line that finally made me stop trying to win her over, because in that sentence she revealed the whole structure of the family dynamic. If I resisted, I was difficult. If I complied, I was generous. If I asked questions, I was making things harder. If Eric lied, it was stress. If I defended myself, it was a character issue. I stopped arguing with her after that. Instead, I called a lawyer, not because I wanted to sue Eric. I did not. I called because I wanted to know if I needed to do anything to protect myself in case they tried to force the issue. The lawyer was a practical guy who sounded bored in the way competent people often do. He told me they had no claim to the property. He told me they were not tenants. He told me that without a written agreement, they had no legal right to the house. He told me to stop letting them in if they showed up with bags and to document everything. He told me to avoid physical arguments and to call police if they refused to leave. That part made me feel ridiculous for even needing to hear it. But it also made me feel a lot better. I was not crazy. I was not overreacting. I was dealing with a boundary problem that other people wanted to turn into a moral test. That weekend, Eric tried a different angle. He came over alone and asked to talk on the porch. I agreed because I wanted him to understand that I was not hiding behind a door. He looked tired. For a second, I almost felt bad for him. Then he started telling me they were running out of options. He said Kelly was upset. He said my mom was upset. He said they had already paid deposits on storage and movers. He said it would cost them too much to back out now. I asked him why he would spend that money before confirming he had a place to live. He said he assumed I would not let him down. That was the most honest thing he had said in weeks. It also made me angrier than anything else. I told him assumptions were not agreements. I told him buying things before asking me was his own choice. He said I always acted like I was better than him. I told him this was not about being better. It was about not allowing him to tell everyone a fantasy and then accuse me of cruelty when the fantasy fell apart. He went quiet for a while. Then he said he had talked to Kelly's parents and they might be able to help with a short-term place, but only if we all cooperated. That sentence made my skin crawl because it sounded like even now he was trying to draft me into a team effort around my property. I told him I was already cooperating by telling the truth. He looked at me like he was trying to understand how I had become this difficult person he had never truly bothered to know. Then he said something I did not expect. He admitted he had already told Kelly's relatives that I had offered the house and then changed my mind for no reason. That was the first time I realized how deep the lie had gone. It was not just family pressure now. It was a whole network of people being fed a story where I was the villain. I asked him whether he understood how serious that was. He shrugged and said he was trying to keep things from falling apart. That answer told me everything. In his mind, lying was a form of maintenance. He genuinely believed the end justified the method. I did not yell. I did not insult him. I simply told him again that the house was not his to assign and that if he needed a place to live, he needed to make actual plans instead of building them on my refusal. He left angry again. I spent the next few days half expecting a surprise visit from movers or my mother. Instead, I got a call from Kelly. That was the moment the story started shifting. She sounded embarrassed and tired. She told me she had not known Eric had promised people anything concrete. She said she thought he had just been hopeful. She said she had already sold some of her own things because she believed they needed to downsize for a while. She said her mother was furious that they had not secured a place first. She said she was beginning to realize Eric had talked as if my house were a certainty when it absolutely was not. I listened carefully because I wanted to know whether she was being manipulated or whether she was part of the manipulation. I came away thinking it was a mix. She had trusted her husband. She had also liked the convenience of the story he was telling. That does not make her evil. It does make her responsible for what happened next. She asked whether I could at least let them store some things in my garage. I said no. That may sound harsh, but I had already learned how these things work. A little storage turns into a few weeks. A few weeks turns into a permanent assumption. I was not interested in creating a foothold. She sounded disappointed but not surprised. Then she apologized for the stress. I told her I understood why she had believed him. I meant that. The problem was not Kelly. The problem was Eric's habit of speaking with enough confidence that people confuse confidence for authorization. By the middle of the following week, Eric and Kelly had moved their stuff into a storage unit and were staying temporarily at my mom and dad's place. That should have been the end of my involvement. It was not. My mom started calling again, now with a new tone. It was less demanding and more wounded. She told me my brother was depressed. She told me he felt rejected by the family. She told me he was sleeping on an air mattress in her den. She told me I had made a mess of the whole thing when I could have just helped. I said calmly that helping would have meant offering something voluntarily, not surrendering my home under pressure. She said I was being technical again. I said yes, because the technical part is what keeps people from getting exploited. That conversation ended badly. A few hours later, my dad texted me privately asking if I would at least meet with Eric one more time. I could tell he was trying to be the reasonable middle ground. I agreed, but only if it was in writing that no one was going to move into my house and that the meeting was just to clear the air. That wording mattered. My dad seemed relieved by the structure. Eric hated it, which was exactly why I insisted on it. We met at a diner near my house on a Thursday evening. I chose the diner because it was public and boring. Those are the best places to keep people honest. Eric looked defeated when he arrived. That almost worked on me until I remembered he had been using desperation as a strategy. My dad looked uncomfortable. My mom was not there, which probably made the whole thing less dramatic for everyone else. Eric started by saying he had not meant to mislead anyone. That was not an apology. That was a legal filter. He said he thought I would eventually realize family comes first. I told him family also includes respecting no. He said he was under a lot of stress. I told him stress does not create a lease. He said Kelly was upset and their marriage was taking a hit. I told him that was between him and Kelly, not me. Then I asked the question I should have asked much earlier. I asked him why he thought he could make plans involving my house without my consent. He stared at me for a long time. Then he admitted that he had been counting on me not making a scene. He said he thought I would grumble and let him in, because that is how I usually am with family emergencies. That line hurt because it was so close to the truth. I had often been the one who gave in to keep the peace. Eric knew that. He had built his plan around my usual exhaustion. I told him that mistake was on him. I told him he had mistaken my patience for permission. My dad finally spoke up and said Eric needed to figure out his own housing. That alone was surprising. My dad usually avoids taking sides. Eric looked stunned for a second and then angry. He said Dad was supposed to help family. My dad said helping family did not mean lying to them or gambling on other people's homes. That was the first time I had ever heard my father say something like that to Eric. It mattered more than I expected. Eric got quiet after that, not accepting, just quiet. When we left the diner, I thought maybe things would calm down. Instead, Eric made one last push through extended family. Aunt Linda called to tell me she had heard there were records showing I had always owned the house. I said yes. She said Eric had been telling people I was refusing to honor a verbal agreement. I told her there was no verbal agreement. She asked whether I had anything in writing. That question irritated me at first, but then I realized she was not doubting me. She was telling me what would end this, so I emailed her the relevant texts. I also emailed the same screenshots to 2 cousins who had been especially eager to lecture me. I did not add commentary. I simply attached the timeline and the messages where Eric asked, where I refused, and where he still tried to speak as though the move was a done deal. I attached the county deed record too. I have to admit that felt good, not because it was revenge, because it was proof. Once the evidence was out, the family story collapsed faster than I expected. A few people apologized. A few people went silent. A couple of them acted like they had never really been involved, which is another family favorite. My Aunt Linda called back and said she had not realized how strong the paper trail was. That was the nicest way anyone had ever said they believed me after seeing receipts. My mom did not apologize immediately. She called to say I had embarrassed Eric. I told her Eric had embarrassed himself. She said I should have handled it privately. I told her I had tried that. She said I had made the family look divided. I told her the division had started when people decided my house was available because they wanted it to be. That conversation ended with a silence so long I thought she might hang up. Instead, she said she needed time. I told her she had all the time she wanted. For the next month, I heard less from her and almost nothing from Eric. That silence was not peaceful at first. It felt weird. I was so used to being part of the family alarm system that the quiet made me uneasy. I kept waiting for another demand. Instead, I got updates from my dad that Eric and Kelly were looking for a cheaper apartment outside Columbus. I heard from Kelly once more, just to say they had found a short-term rental farther out and were trying to reset. She sounded drained. I think she realized her marriage had started with a lie she had partly believed and partly ignored. That is not a fun place to be. A few weeks later, my mom finally invited me over alone. I thought she wanted to resume the argument. Instead, she looked tired and smaller than usual. She said she had been wrong about some of it. She did not say everything, and she definitely did not say it with enough enthusiasm for me to call it a full apology. But it was the first time she admitted that Eric had gone too far. She said she had believed he just needed help. She said she had not understood that he had been telling people I had already agreed. She said she was sorry for pushing me so hard. That mattered, not enough to erase everything, but enough that I did not leave angry. I told her I would always help when I could. I told her I would not help by giving up my home. I told her there was a difference. She nodded, which I took as progress. I am not naive enough to think that one argument transformed my family. It did not. Eric still has a talent for making himself the center of every uncomfortable conversation. My mom still sometimes checks whether I am being generous enough, but the dynamic changed. That is the part people do not always understand. Big fights do not always end with someone being cut off or humiliated. Sometimes they end with a boundary that finally sticks. Sometimes the win is just that the lie cannot survive contact with the documents. In my case, the strongest thing I did was stay calm long enough to gather the proof. I did not rage. I did not threaten. I did not make up a counter-story. I just kept records and let the truth do the work. My brother hated that because it gave him nowhere to hide. He could not out-talk a deed. He could not outsmile a text message. He could not turn a mortgage statement into a moral issue. The house stayed mine. That sounds obvious now, but for a few weeks it felt like I was defending the most basic fact in the world. Eric and Kelly eventually rented a smaller place about 20 minutes from my parents. Their marriage survived the immediate crisis, though I heard it was rough for a while. My mom stopped mentioning my spare room as if it were community property. My dad became a lot more direct with Eric than he used to be. I think that was the real outcome nobody expected. Not just that I kept my house. It was that the family lost the ability to pretend my boundaries were optional. A couple months after everything settled, I replaced the front door lock anyway, not because anyone had a key, because I wanted to do something practical for myself that had nothing to do with family drama. I also framed the county deed and kept it in my office drawer instead of the wall because that felt less dramatic. I laugh about that now, but at the time it gave me peace. There was something grounding about knowing the paperwork matched reality. It sounds stupid unless you have ever had someone try to rewrite your own life in front of you. Then it makes perfect sense. I still think about that dinner sometimes, not the yelling part, the part right before it. The moment where Eric truly believed I would fold because family should always share. That was the mistake that cost him. He confused my calm with weakness. He confused my silence with consent. He confused my willingness to listen with agreement. By the time he realized I was serious, I had already built the paper trail he could not talk around. That is why the line I said at the table mattered so much. It was not clever in some movie sense. It was just true. My house did not come with his name on it. It never had. And once the truth was on the table, no amount of family pressure could change that.